Chapter 1. How Korean Court Ladies Perfected 15 Layers of Silk. Hey guys, tonight we're starting slow. So go ahead and dim the lights, flatten the pillow, and let your brain slide into that pleasantly empty space where you can still technically hear me, but you're no longer responsible for remembering anything I say. Because tonight, we're gliding into the quiet, layered, and very, very fabric-heavy world of Korean court dress. Specifically, how the noblewomen and palace ladies of the Joseon Dynasty somehow perfected the art of wearing 15 layers of silk, while looking serene, composed, and not at all like a sweating human souffle. So, sink down, get comfy, and let's drift into Chapter 1. The Joseon Dynasty liked rules. They adored rules. They collected rules the way some people collect keychains from airports they regret visiting. Once the dynasty was established in 1392, its rulers decided that everything should be neat, orderly, and thoroughly categorized, including clothing. Clothing wasn't just clothing. It was a ranked system, a language, a moral statement, and an ongoing competition about who could look the most ethereal while being buried in fabric. And at the center of this textile opera were the court ladies. These women didn't just wear clothes. They carried entire ideologies on their shoulders, usually in silk, usually embroidered, and usually weighing enough to gently encourage scoliosis. But we're easing into things. So let's take a gentle step back, like we're sliding across polished palace floors in socks, and look at how this layering obsession began. It started with Confucianism, because of course it did. Joseon was a Confucian state, and Confucianism had a very firm stance on modesty. Essentially, please cover everything, including anything that might resemble a shape. The ideal noblewoman was meant to be calm, virtuous, gracious, and wrapped like a very polite onion. Layers weren't just a fashion choice, they were a moral aesthetic. The more fabric you wore, the more respectable you appeared. There was probably an unofficial motto: why wear 2 layers when you can wear 12, plus an extra sash for emotional stability? The layering also had a practical side, sort of. Korea has winters that could politely be described as freezing, and court ladies still had to stand in long ceremonies pretending they were perfectly comfortable. Add to that the fact that palace buildings were beautiful but drafty, and the appeal of multiple silk layers becomes pretty clear. Well, clearish. Let's be honest, 15 layers is a lifestyle choice. So, what were these layers? And how did anyone remember the order? Because if most of us struggle to fold a fitted sheet, the idea of constructing a full palace outfit sounds like a group project no one asked for. Let's drift into the first layer, the one closest to the skin, the sakka. This was the base layer, usually made of thin cotton or light silk, something soft and gentle. Think of it as the "this is fine" starting point. It was the simplest piece, designed to soak up sweat and human reality before all the fancy layers went on top. Over that came more underlayers, sometimes 2, sometimes 5, depending on rank and season. Each had its own name because of course they did. If Confucian scholars had their way, socks would have philosophical treatises carved into them. The multi-layered undergarments helped build volume, because elegant court silhouettes required bulk. The desired shape was wide, smooth, and slightly puffed, like a cloud with disciplined posture. And the court ladies achieved this with the help of the chima, the skirt, or more accurately, several skirts. A noblewoman's chima wasn't just a skirt, it was infrastructure. The outer chima needed support underneath, which meant multiple underskirts to create that rounded, floating shape. Imagine trying to build a graceful hill out of fabric. Then imagine being expected to walk like a gliding swan while wearing it. We're still only warming up. On the upper body, the most important layer was the jiagari, the jacket. The jiagari is one of those deceptively simple garments. You look at it and think, oh, that's cute. But then you realize that length, collar shape, tie placement, sleeve curve, and color were all loaded with meaning. Wearing the wrong jiagari in the wrong situation was like showing up to a royal funeral wearing bright neon leggings. Someone would definitely write a report about it. And palace ladies were all about correct presentation. Silk was the preferred material, partly because it draped beautifully, partly because it whispered luxury. The court employed entire workshops of artisans who specialized in producing silk fine enough to satisfy the noble classes. These craftsmen must have had nerves of steel, because one snag, one uneven thread, and an entire piece could be rejected. It's hard enough to fold regular laundry. Imagine your clothing being inspected under moral philosophy standards. Now, let's float a bit deeper into the palace. Court ladies had different rankings, from senior attendants to junior palace maids, and each rank dictated not just how many layers they wore, but what kind of silk, what colors, how much embroidery, and what accessories they could add. It was like a very strict fashion game with no shortcuts, no cheat codes, and a built-in hierarchy that everyone pretended was totally reasonable. The higher your rank, the more layers you were expected to wear. And at ceremonial events, the number went up. Weddings, royal birthdays, ancestor rites, each had its own dress code. Sometimes, a high-ranking court lady might wear more than 15 layers, each carefully arranged so she looked like a flower in full bloom, not a fabric avalanche. These layers weren't thrown on randomly. They followed a precise order, like assembling a very delicate, very expensive sandwich. And the topmost layers showcased the best materials: deep-hued silks, gold thread embroidery, and patterns loaded with symbolism. Phoenixes were common, especially for queens and crown princesses. Lotus flowers symbolized purity. Peonies meant prosperity. Dragons were reserved for the king, because monarchs love reminding everyone that they're the main character. But here's where things get funny in that sleepy, historical irony kind of way. Despite all the symbolism and materials, the overall effect had to look effortless. You couldn't show strain. You couldn't look like you were melting under 12 pounds of textile. Your expression needed to remain serene, like, "Oh, these layers? Yes, I wear them all the time. I barely notice them. My neck definitely doesn't hurt." Let's drift over to the matter of hair, because hair, in Joseon, was its own engineering project. Court ladies often wore their hair in elaborate styles involving thick coils, silk ribbons, and ornamental pins called binyo. Senior court women might even use wigs, large, heavy ones, known as gash. These wigs were beautiful, impressive, and quietly concerning. A well-constructed gash could weigh several kilograms, which means some noble women walked around with the equivalent of a small toddler attached to their heads. This eventually became such a problem that kings began issuing decrees discouraging oversized wigs. When a monarch feels compelled to regulate wig density, you know things have escalated. Let's keep gliding through palace life. Even movement was choreographed. When you're layered like a ceremonial lasagna, you can't just stroll around casually. Court ladies took small, gliding steps. The skirts naturally limited stride length, and etiquette reinforced the restriction. Hands were kept folded, sleeves drawn in. Everything had to be contained, calm, controlled. Even if you were sweating inside 15 layers. Inside the court, these women had demanding roles. They managed ceremonies, assisted the queen, prepared royal clothing, oversaw palace housekeeping, or served in the king's private quarters. Their days were busy, structured, and full of responsibility. The clothing served as both a uniform and a reminder of their position. Each layer reinforced restraint, duty, and hierarchy. Yet at the same time, the court was one of the few places where women could wield real influence. Senior palace ladies often knew the king more intimately than most of his ministers did. They overheard everything, managed everything, and could nudge decisions quietly behind the scenes. The layers gave them status and visibility, or invisibility cloaked in formality, depending on how you look at it. There's a gentle irony in that. The more layers they wore, the more constrained they seemed. But the more constrained they appeared, the more power they actually held. Let's continue drifting through the layers, because we still haven't touched on color symbolism. Colors mattered a lot in Joseon fashion. And by a lot, I mean some of the court regulations read like someone spilled Skittles into a book of moral philosophy. Bright red was reserved for queens and princesses during major ceremonies. Deep blue and jade green were common for noble women. Younger women wore softer pinks and light greens. Senior ladies preferred muted tones reflecting gravity and dignity. White was seen as pure, modest, and appropriate for almost everything except when it wasn't. The rules were extremely specific. If a color chart had been posted in the palace, it would have taken up 3 walls. And of course, these colors were all applied to silk. Silk that had been dyed, woven, softened, and embroidered by specialists who learned their craft over years. The Palace Textile Bureau was a whole world of its own, stocked with talented women artisans who created fabrics fine enough to satisfy the ever-growing expectations of high nobility. So when we talk about 15 layers, we're not just talking about thickness. We're talking about a visual harmony. Each layer had a purpose. Some gave structure. Some added warmth. Some added color. Some served purely as status markers. But together, they created the unmistakable silhouette of the Joseon court lady, a shape that was soft, flowing, rounded, and quietly regal. And because this is a sleepy monologue, we're going to drift through one more detail before this part ends: the weight. You might imagine silk as light, very feather soft. But stack enough silk sheets on top of each other, add embroidery, add ribbons, add a multi-layered skirt, and suddenly the whole ensemble weighs several kilograms. Enough that standing still for long ceremonies became an endurance sport. Enough that sitting required careful folding, arranging, and adjusting. Enough that palace ladies had to learn not just how to wear clothing, but how to inhabit it. Yet the records show that many of them took pride in this. Mastering the layers meant mastering palace life. It meant proving your discipline, your status, your elegance, your ability to show that you were above discomfort. Because if you could survive 15 layers of silk without visibly suffering, then clearly you could survive anything the court threw at you. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Silk. We're gliding straight back into the palace now, without any greetings, without any settling in. Just slipping quietly into the next layer of this slow-moving textile saga. Silk in the Joseon world wasn't simply worn. It was constructed carefully, deliberately, and sometimes with the kind of stubborn dedication usually reserved for building bridges or emotionally over-investing in a houseplant. The clothing of court ladies was less an outfit and more a portable architectural project, and every layer served a structural purpose. Let's drift deeper into how this engineering worked. The first thing to understand is that Korean clothing followed the principle of wrapped volume rather than tailored shape. Unlike European bodices, stays, or fitted gowns, Joseon garments rarely hugged the body. Instead, they floated around it, forming a softly expanding silhouette that was more about presence than figure. The layers provided fullness, but they weren't just stacked, they were arranged. Imagine opening a series of delicate paper fans, each a different color, each slightly offset to create a sense of depth. Now imagine wearing those fans and pretending it's completely normal. That's essentially the effect court ladies were going for. The secret was in the underlayers, the unsung heroes of court fashion. These pieces were simple, often undecorated, and rarely noticed, but without them, the entire silhouette would collapse. The Joseon court had a firm belief that beauty began beneath the surface, philosophically and fashionably. Most women wore multiple sakama, or underskirts. Sometimes 3, sometimes 7, occasionally even more, especially during ceremonial days when excess was considered the height of propriety. These underskirts varied in thickness, from gauzy silk to sturdier ramie or cotton. The lowest layers gave support, the middle layers built volume, the upper layers added smoothness. The result was a gentle, dome-like shape that allowed the outer skirt to glide smoothly over the form beneath it. Court records mention women who were admired for the perfect puff of their skirts. Not too wide, not too narrow, gracefully rounded like a well-trained cloud. Achieving that balance took experience. It took patience. It took accepting that your entire morning might revolve around arranging fabric in a way that appeared completely effortless. Let's float to the sleeves for a moment. Sleeves in Joseon dress were long, generous, and almost architectural in their own right. They framed the body, softened gestures, and created rhythmic movements when the wearer walked. For court ladies, sleeves were part of the visual performance. A simple hand motion was transformed into a slow, floating gesture, as though the air itself had decided to participate in the etiquette. The sleeve edges, the geodol, were often decorated with contrasting colors, turning the arms into gentle lines of visual poetry. Every time a court lady lowered her hand, adjusted her sash, or accepted a ceremonial object, those borders created a soft, flowing arc of color. The sleeves weren't just fabric, they were choreography. But the choice of color wasn't merely aesthetic. Each hue was rooted in strict guidelines that drew from Confucian principles, cosmology, and social hierarchy. The palace didn't do random. If something was red, it was red for a reason. We can drift through those colors now, letting each settle lightly. Red, the brightest and most assertive color, belonged primarily to queens, princesses, and very high-ranking court women. It symbolized life, power, and auspicious energy. In the muted halls of the palace, a flash of crimson was a quiet announcement. Someone important was gliding through. Blue was often worn by noblewomen and senior attendants. Dark blue suggested dignity, lighter blue implied youth or gentleness. Blue was also associated with wood in the Asian five elements theory, symbolizing growth and renewal. Green was a favorite for young unmarried women or lower-ranking attendants. Soft green suggested modesty and freshness. Deep green represented maturity and harmony. Yellow was rare, reserved for royalty and deeply tied to the center of the cosmological universe. Wearing it without permission would have caused the kind of bureaucratic meltdown that only a Confucian court could produce. And then there was white, the most Confucian of colors, beloved for its association with purity and humility. Ironically, white was both the simplest and the most technically difficult color to maintain, because, as anyone who has ever worn white knows, life immediately conspires against it. Now let's float down the palace corridors, where dozens of court ladies moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew their clothing was symbolic, scrutinized, and occasionally life-determining. Their daily routines revolved around duty. The palace wasn't a place of lounging, despite how graceful everything looked. Court ladies managed rituals, prepared royal meals, maintained ceremonial objects, organized the queen's chambers, and ensured that every aspect of palace life followed protocol. Their clothing, layered, heavy, and precise, reinforced their discipline. You can't exactly sprint through a hallway wearing 15 layers of silk. Movement had to be measured, balanced, thoughtful. Even if you were late, you arrived late elegantly. Let's drift back to the jaggery, the upper garment that framed the entire outfit. Early Joseon jaggery were longer, often reaching the waist. But over time, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, the jaggery became shorter, sometimes extremely short, creating a very specific silhouette, a small, cropped upper garment paired with a dramatically voluminous skirt. This contrast was considered attractive, refined, and dignified. It also required careful layering to avoid, well, exposure. Court ladies solved this by adding additional inner jaggery, long undercollars, chest wraps, and modesty panels. By the time the outer jaggery was tied into place with a narrow fabric ribbon called the gorium, the woman wearing it might already be covered in 3 or 4 inner layers. It's the kind of clothing system that would make a modern stylist quietly pass out. Now let's drift a little deeper into palace hierarchy, because ranking determined everything down to fabric thickness. The palace wasn't shy about social distinctions. Every layer had a job. Every accessory had a boundary. Senior court ladies could wear heavier, richer silks, often with woven patterns or elegant embroidery. Their skirts were fuller, their jaggery better tailored, their hair accessories more elaborate. They represented the queen's authority, so their clothing served as a visual extension of royal dignity. Junior attendants, on the other hand, wore simpler fabrics, lighter silk, polished cotton, or fine ramie. Their colors were softer, their embroidery minimal. Their accessories were modest. Their hair was arranged in simpler buns. But even the lowest-ranking palace maid still wore layers. Still dressed with care. Still maintained that signature Joseon silhouette. Clothing was proof of belonging. Let's drift briefly to the matter of hair, because hairstyles were as layered as the garments. Court ladies wore their hair in structured shapes, the Jokjin Miori or Ianjun Miori styles, depending on age and rank. These styles involved parting, coiling, and binding the hair in specific ways, usually ornamented with silk ribbons and polished hairpins. Higher-ranking women wore the famous binyo, long hairpins made of jade, silver, gold, or even coral. The shape and material of the binyo indicated the wearer's place in the court. During grand ceremonies, senior women wore tiaguji, large decorative pieces added to the back of the hair that made the whole structure look like a small architectural monument. It's no wonder the palace restricted head movements. If you turned too suddenly, something heavy might shift, and the entire hairstyle could slide into an unplanned physics experiment. Some women wore gash, those substantial wigs that could weigh up to 3 or 4 kilograms. They were considered glamorous, especially among noble families, and were often embellished with flowers, jewels, and silk. But as glamorous as they were, they caused enough injuries and fainting episodes that the court eventually banned excessive wig usage. When a government needs to intervene because your hair is too powerful, that's a sign of dedication. Let's drift back to embroidery, because this is where the clothing becomes truly mesmerizing in its detail. Embroidery on court garments was performed by highly trained artisans who passed their skills from mother to daughter. They worked in well-lit palace workshops, using thin needles and delicate threads to create shimmering scenes on silk. Their patterns weren't random. Each one was symbolic. Phoenixes represented the queen. Peonies meant wealth. Lotuses symbolized purity. Cranes hinted at long life. Butterflies whispered of joy. Clouds suggested harmony. A garment might include dozens of these motifs, arranged in quiet balance across sleeves, hems, and collars. When the wearer moved, the embroidery caught the light, making the silk appear alive. But embroidery also added weight. A heavily embellished layer could weigh almost as much as 2 plain ones. So the more important you were, the heavier your outfit became. A humble reminder that prestige often comes with back pain. Now let's glide into the matter of seasonal dressing, because the palace didn't leave that up to personal choice either. In summer, layers lightened, though not as much as you'd expect. Court ladies still wore multiple layers, because modesty outranked comfort, but fabrics changed. Rami, a breathable plant fiber, became popular. Light silk was used more often. Colors softened. In winter, clothing thickened. Cotton padding was added to underlayers. Outer coats like the durumaji or the ceremonial wansam were worn more frequently. These coats were long, flowing, and warm, often beautifully embroidered and lined. But even in winter, the overall silhouette had to remain elegant. You couldn't just throw on a giant coat and call it a day. Every added layer had to harmonize with the existing structure. Even warmth had rules. Let's drift into the emotional side of this world, because clothing wasn't just physical. It shaped experiences. Court ladies lived with constant scrutiny. Their behavior, their words, their posture, their attire, all watched. Clothing was a shield, a statement, a requirement, but sometimes it was also a burden. Heavy, complicated, restricting, and symbolic. And yet many of these women took pride in the mastery of their garments. Learning to wear 15 layers wasn't unlike learning a musical instrument. It required practice, repetition, and patience. Once mastered, it became a kind of second nature, an embodied discipline that reflected their identity as members of the royal household. Clothing was their environment, their status, their daily ritual. Chapter 3: Ritual Days, Royal Nights. Ceremonial days in the Joseon court were like slow-moving festivals of fabric. No one rushed. No one hurried. Everything unfolded with the gentle inevitability of steam rising from a teacup. And at the center of all this ceremonial calm were the court ladies, wrapped in their many layers of silk, performing their roles with steady hands and carefully controlled breaths. Let's drift quietly into these ritual days now, as though we're slipping into a long corridor lined with lanterns. Ceremonies were the backbone of Joseon palace life. They marked the seasons, honored ancestors, celebrated royal birthdays, observed weddings, rewarded scholars, greeted foreign envoys, and reaffirmed the ruler's legitimacy. Each ritual was part theater, part devotion, and part bureaucratic performance. The palace loved formality almost as much as it loved assigning 15 layers of clothing to anyone who stepped near a royal banner. For court ladies, these days were intense, but never hurried. Their movements looked effortless, but beneath the calm surface was a complex coordination of tasks. They prepared food for rites, arranged ceremonial objects, assisted the queen or princess, and managed intricate etiquette protocols that would overwhelm anyone not raised in the palace system from childhood. Let's drift into the early morning of one such ceremonial day. The palace was quiet as the sky lightened. Court ladies rose before dawn, slipping out of bedding that was more functional than luxurious. Their first task wasn't to dress in ceremonial garments, but to prepare themselves for a long, structured day. Hair was arranged. Faces were washed quietly with cold water. Their uniforms for early tasks were simple compared to what they'd wear later, but still required layering and neatness, always neatness. After morning duties came the transformation. Court ladies didn't dress alone. Assistants helped them into layers in the correct order, because if you mixed up the sequence, you weren't just uncomfortable. You were technically violating palace protocol. Imagine being scolded by a superior for accidentally putting skirt layer number 4 above skirt layer number 3. Palace life loved rules that no one outside it could possibly memorize. Let's drift through the dressing process now. The first layers were functional: the sakgat undergarments, the inner jiagari, the modesty wraps. These kept everything in place, protected the outer silk, and provided the smooth foundation required for the full silhouette. Next came the sakama, the underskirts, arranged like careful scaffolding. Each one needed to be tied at just the right height. Too high, and the outer skirt floated awkwardly. Too low, and it sagged. Court ladies developed an intuitive sense for height and proportion. Being off by even a finger's width could throw off the visual harmony. Then came the outer chima. This was the visible skirt, rich, wide, and sweeping. On important days, these skirts were made of high-quality silk that shimmered gently in the light. Colors were chosen according to rank and event. Pale greens for young attendants, bold reds for princesses, deep blues and purples for noblewomen. The skirt tied around the chest, comfortably for some, less comfortably for others. After the skirt was arranged, the outer jiagari was added. This required aligning the collar, smoothing the seams, tying the gorium ribbon just so. Nothing could be crooked. Nothing could be rushed. And then came the ceremonial layers. Queens and princesses wore special robes on ritual days, garments like the dange, the wonsam, or the jiaki. The wonsam was especially iconic, long, flowing, often embroidered with phoenixes or floral motifs, with sleeves that draped like soft banners. These robes were coded in symbolism. You didn't just wear a wonsam, you embodied a role in the cosmic order. It was fashioned with celestial paperwork attached. Even mid-ranking court ladies wore ceremonial coats or jackets on special days. Their garments were less extravagant than those of royalty, but still required meticulous arrangement. Each layer added weight, warmth, and dignity. Once dressed, these women waited. Standing for long periods was common in palace ceremonies. They stood with their hands folded neatly, sleeves draped, posture straight. Their faces remained serene. No fidgeting, no sighing, no adjusting their many layers, even if something itched or shifted or threatened to slide out of place. The palace expected composure. Emotions were meant to be as controlled as collar seams. Let's float into one of the most important ceremonies, Jongmyo ancestral rites. These rites honored the spirits of deceased kings and queens. They were solemn, slow, and deeply rooted in Confucian philosophy. Court ladies played supporting roles, arranging offerings, assisting in the ritual progression, ensuring that everything flowed without disruption. On days like this, the palace seemed to move in a single coordinated breath. Every footstep echoed softly. Every garment rustled gently. Every gesture connected the living court to generations of ancestors watching from the spirit tablets. The clothing matched the atmosphere, layered, dignified, symbolic. Court ladies wearing heavy silk robes stood like living extensions of the ritual itself. Now let's drift to a different ceremonial setting, the Gyeongbokgung Palace courtyard during a royal birthday. Birthday celebrations weren't loud or festive. They were orderly, measured, and saturated with symbolism. Court ladies prepared tables of delicacies, seasonal foods, and ceremonial wines. They arranged screens, banners, and cushions. They guided the queen, princess, or royal consort into place. They managed the flow of congratulatory greetings. And through it all, their silk layers swished softly around them like quiet whispers. Festival attire was brighter than ancestral attire. Reds, pinks, jade greens. Embroidery with butterflies and peonies, symbols of joy and good fortune. Even the junior attendants wore slightly richer colors than usual. The palace recognized that birthdays were special, even though it maintained its calm, Confucian composure. But the weight of ceremonial garments didn't magically lighten for joyful occasions. Court ladies still carried multiple layers, still maintained posture, still moved with steady dignity. The joy was symbolic. The discipline was real. Now let's float into the world of royal weddings, where clothing reached peak extravagance. Royal brides wore the warat, an elaborately embroidered robe covered in symbols of fertility, prosperity, and harmony. Beneath the warat were layers upon layers of inner garments, underskirts, chest wraps, and giagari. Even the socks, yes, the socks, were embroidered. Court ladies played essential roles in weddings. They dressed the bride. They arranged her hair, adorned her with a heavy jakduri headdress, and ensured that her robes draped correctly. They walked with her in the procession, carrying symbolic items like silk screens, ritual fans, or bright banners. Weddings were stunning to watch, but exhausting to participate in. Court ladies spent hours standing, adjusting, assisting, and guiding. Their layers kept them warm in the winter and far too warm in the summer. But through it all, they remained calm. Silent. This wasn't just clothing. It was training in patience. Let's drift now into palace evenings, when ceremony ended and the quietly chaotic work of court life resumed. After rituals, court ladies didn't simply relax. They had evening tasks, preparing the royal chambers, organizing supplies, documenting inventory, cleaning ritual implements, and assisting the queen or royal consorts with nightly routines. Their ceremonial layers were removed carefully, one by one, folded or hung with meticulous care. Silk required respect. Sweat had to air out. Embroidery needed protection. Even undressing was a ritual. By night, court ladies returned to simpler garments, comfortable compared to their daytime layers, yet still layered enough to maintain modesty and warmth. They slept lightly, often in communal rooms, always prepared to rise early again. Let's drift a little deeper into their lived experiences. Court life wasn't glamorous. It was regimented, structured, restrained. For many women, it was also lifelong, because palace ladies entered the court young and often remained unmarried, dedicating their lives to service. Clothing ruled their days. Ritual ruled their season. Hierarchy ruled everything else. But there was companionship too. Senior palace women mentored juniors. They taught them how to layer garments properly, how to maintain posture, how to move with grace, how to stitch, how to prepare ceremonial items, how to navigate subtle palace politics. Knowledge passed from woman to woman, forming a quiet network of skill and shared discipline. And sometimes, rarely but meaningfully, there were moments of softness. Late-night conversations. Shared laughter over a wardrobe mishap. Someone helping a younger maid fix a crooked ribbon. Someone adjusting another's collar before a ceremony. Small glimpses of humanity within the rigid palace structure. Let's drift into the sensory world of clothing again. Silk rustled softly with every movement. The sound was faint, like leaves brushing against each other in a gentle breeze. The weight of layers pressed lightly on the shoulders, reminding each woman of her responsibilities. The faint scent of powdered rice flour, used in traditional cosmetics, mingled with the smell of polished wood and ink. The palace was quiet, but never silent. Footsteps echoed. Screens slid softly. Sleeves brushed surfaces. And always there was the subtle whisper of silk. Now let's follow one court lady, an anonymous figure, because thousands lived and died without their names recorded, through a ceremonial year. In spring, she wore soft greens, helping prepare seasonal offerings. In summer, she endured heat beneath lighter silk layers, fanning the queen during audiences. In autumn, she dressed in warm tones while assisting with harvest rituals. In winter, she wrapped herself in padded layers to attend midnight ancestral rites. Her clothing changed with the calendar. Her tasks changed with the ritual cycle. But her layered discipline remained constant. For her, silk wasn't luxury. It was duty. Now, let's drift a little deeper into the palace, past the rooms where fabric was sorted, and into the quieter corners where court ladies spent most of their daily lives sewing, steaming, stitching, and, occasionally, wondering why their entire existence revolved around tiny needles and silk threads so fine they practically evaporated if you breathed too hard. Because beneath all the layers, all the elegance, and all the ceremonial beauty, the real story of Korean court dress is the story of the women who made it. And the way they lived is one of the more quietly heartbreaking, bizarre, and disciplined realities in palace history. These were the gangmyo, the court women. Officially servants, unofficially the backbone of the entire royal wardrobe system. And there were many types. Some were skilled seamstresses. Others handled weaving, spinning, embroidery, dyeing, or dressing members of the royal family. And some were simply assigned to haul giant bolts of fabric across the palace because no matter how graceful a court looks in dramas, someone still has to carry the laundry. Their lives were contained. That's the most peaceful word for it. They lived in the palace. They slept there. They rarely left. And the palace was not a wander around as you please kind of place. It was more like a never-ending historical summer camp, except the activities were mandatory, your supervisors were always watching, and you probably wore 4 layers of clothing even when the air felt like soup. Most gangmyo joined the palace very young. Some as pre-teens, some even younger, essentially children who were dropped into a microcity with its own rules, hierarchy, and social ecosystem. And the ranks mattered a lot. Imagine high school cliques, but embroidered. The highest-ranking court ladies weren't queens or concubines. Those were on a different ladder entirely. These were women like the sangung, the head officials among the palace women. They held real administrative power. Below them were women assigned to specialties. Embroidery rooms, sewing rooms, weaving halls, laundry stations, fragrance chambers, and yes, the storage rooms where raw silk was kept under lock and key like it was state treasure. Which, honestly, it kind of was. And at the bottom were the younger women or trainees, sometimes barely teenagers, who learned how to spend their entire lives perfecting movements so small and delicate that most people today would need magnifying glasses just to see what they were doing. But despite the hierarchy, the palace was still a place of constant surveillance. Any misstep could be punished. Even something as tiny as miscounting ribbon lengths or folding robes incorrectly could have consequences. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, but certainly nothing that helped you relax. Ironically, the one thing court ladies did not do was glamorous lounging in ornate rooms sipping tea all day. That's a drama invention. Real palace life looked more like sit more, stitch more, eat the small lunch, stitch again, adjust the queen's sleeve, steam the king's outer coat, don't mess up the pleats, don't sneeze on the silk, don't blink too hard, lots of rules. Lots of fabric. Zero glamour. But even within that rigid world, fashion still managed to evolve. Mostly because these women were incredibly skilled textile experts. And when the layers of royal silk grew more elaborate, it was largely because palace women were capable of making things so finely crafted that royalty could afford to be a little extra. Now, about those 15 layers. Of course, it wasn't a single standardized 15-layer rule, because history would never make things that simple. Instead, the layering varied by era and occasion. For example, royal weddings were basically marathons of clothing. Brides could wear an inner white layer, a middle robe, a colored robe, a silk overrobe, a ceremonial coat, a wadded layer for shape, and then several more layers for modesty, formality, rank, color balance, and whatever the senior court lady believed was appropriate that day. And that was just for the torso. Sleeves could be layered too: thin sleeves, thicker sleeves, outer bands, contrasting cuffs, ornamental trims, each one stitched by someone who might have been squinting over the fabric since before sunrise. Nothing about it was quick. Even basic clothing took time. A single robe could require hand-spun thread, multiple dye baths, stretch silk, hand sewing, steamed finishing, pressed folds, dozens of tiny, invisible stitches. And because royal wardrobes were designed to last for years or decades, they were maintained constantly. If a thread popped out of place, court ladies fixed it. If the fabric lost its sheen, someone re-steamed it. If a color faded, a new piece was dyed and skillfully blended so the royal wearer never looked even slightly off shade. That was the job. Maintain perfection so subtly that the monarch never noticed the labor behind it. Let's float over now to the dyeing rooms, one of the most intense spaces in the palace textile system. Unlike today, where dyeing can be done with synthetic chemicals and takes maybe an afternoon, traditional dyes were made from roots, bark, berries, flowers, insects, minerals, basically anything nature offered. And extracting color from nature is one thing. Coaxing that color to stick to silk in even, perfect hues, that's a whole separate universe. The color red, for instance, came from safflower petals. But petals fade fast, so to get enough dye, you needed entire baskets of flowers. And then you had to separate out the yellow pigment from the red. And then you had to coax the remaining color into a stable dye bath. And then you had to gently introduce silk into the mixture without shocking the fibers or creating streaks. It was like babysitting a very emotionally sensitive pot of soup. Blue came from indigo, stinky, fermented indigo. It had to be aerated, stirred, settled, revived, and fed like a pet. Yellow came from gardenia or pagoda tree blossoms, requiring precise temperature control. Blacks were layered dyes, a foundation color, then iron salts, then another wash. You'd think royal clothing would involve diamonds and gold. Instead, it involved a lot of boiling plants and hoping for the best. But the results were stunning, and the layers allowed colors to blend and deepen. A pale blue inner robe under a translucent outer one created a soft cyan glow. A red underlayer beneath green added warmth. Gold threads shone differently depending on how many textile layers sat beneath them. Court ladies understood this optical effect long before modern color theory. They used it intentionally. If a queen needed to convey authority, the layers would be chosen with dramatic contrast. If she needed softness, they used pastels. If she needed to appear modest or mournful, darker underlayers were positioned where they subtly peeped through the topmost robe. And somehow these women pulled this off in an environment where they could barely leave the palace. Let's drift into the royal dressing process now. Imagine a queen preparing for a major ceremony. Not a crisis, not a coronation, just a regular palace event. Dressing her was a team sport involving multiple specialists. One handled the underlayers. Another draped the formal robe. Another adjusted the silk bands. Someone checked the skirt pleats. Someone ensured colors were balanced. Someone arranged her hair ornaments. And someone, usually a senior lady, inspected everything with the emotional expression of a tax auditor. Everything had to fall perfectly. Silk is slippery. Layers shift. Sleeves rotate. If a pleat wandered 1 centimeter to the left, it was someone's job to fix it before the queen even noticed. Which is why palace dressing rooms sometimes resembled quiet, extremely slow-moving storms of fabric and people who had learned to walk without disturbing a single fiber. And then there was the issue of weight. Because here's the thing no historical drama will tell you. Layered silk is heavy. Even though each individual layer is thin, multiply that by 10, 12, 15, and suddenly a royal lady is wearing what amounts to a very elegant weighted blanket. It wasn't painful, but it was definitely a workout. You couldn't just swing your arms or twist your torso. The layers resisted. They pushed back. They made every motion a slow, dignified glide. Which, honestly, is probably why the fashion lasted so long. Heavy clothing naturally encourages slow movement, and slow movement looks regal. The layering also interacted with climate. Korea has very cold winters, and palace buildings didn't exactly have central heating. Wearing many layers in winter actually helped. Not dramatically, but enough to take the edge off. In summer, though, let's just say the palace had a lot of shaded walkways for a reason. But even in the heat, court ladies maintained impeccable aesthetics. Silk was kept smooth, unwrinkled, and unblemished. What? Not allowed to show. Son? Avoided. Fabric? Protected at all times. For women who spent their lives in the palace, beauty wasn't just style. It was discipline, a quiet kind of devotion to craftsmanship. And even though they rarely received credit, they shaped royal identity more than anyone outside the palace walls ever knew. Let's float over now to something even more subtle, scent. Because yes, layers of silk weren't just visual. They were aromatic. Royal wardrobes included pockets and pouches for fragrance sachets, filled with herbs and woods like sandalwood, mugwort, or clove. These kept insects away but also created a soft aura when the wearer moved. Imagine a gentle ribbon of scent trailing behind someone who walked very slowly because 15 layers of fabric demanded it. Some court ladies specialized entirely in fragrance, selecting which scents should accompany which layers, based on the season, the event, or the personality of the wearer. No perfumes, just natural, quiet aroma. And it made sense. Silk holds scent well. Layers trap it. A light herbal fragrance could linger around a queen all day. The effect must have been enchanting in the most understated way. Nothing flashy, just a soft sensory halo floating through palace halls that were already so quiet you could hear water droplets hit stone courtyards. All this, to produce what we now call traditional clothing, but which was really a living art form maintained by women whose names almost never survived in records. But their work did. The stitching techniques, the layering logic, the dye formulas, the understanding of body movement within heavy clothing. These skills were passed down quietly, woman to woman, generation to generation, inside the palace walls. And the result was a style so refined and so meticulously constructed that even centuries later, it still feels impossibly elegant. Let's drift forward a little more. We're still in the palace, still watching court ladies move through the day. As the sun sets, they fold fabric, organize thread spools, and prepare tomorrow's garments. The palace grows dim. Lanterns glow softly. Conversations quiet down. And the rooms where silk is stored fill with the faint rustle of fabric being stacked neatly, almost ceremonially. This is the quieter side of palace life, the part no one wrote poems about, but which made every royal image possible. No elaborate court painting would exist without the women who stitched the clothing. No ceremony would feel regal without their craftsmanship. No dynasty could maintain its aesthetic without their silent expertise. Let's drift a little farther into the palace now, into the areas where symbolism ruled everything. Because if there's one universal truth about royal clothing, especially highly layered royal clothing, it's that none of it was purely about comfort, or beauty, or even tradition. Layers were messages. Messages that whispered things like, this person is important. This person is unreachable. This person represents the state, so don't expect them to sit down comfortably. In the Korean court, every fold, every hue, every visible sliver of underlayer meant something. And behind these symbolic costumes were court ladies who understood the language of clothing more fluently than most scholars of the time understood actual literature. To appreciate the artistry, we need to float into the world of color hierarchy. Korea had a deep, structured color philosophy tied to Confucian values, directional elements, seasons, and social rank. And when these colors were layered, they created subtle meaning that most people outside the palace barely noticed, but royalty definitely did. Take the color yellow, for example. Today it might feel cheerful, sunny, maybe a little snack food adjacent. But in the Korean court, yellow was an imperial adjacent shade, precious and controlled. You didn't just casually wear rich golden hues near the royal family unless you wanted a politely worded warning from someone much higher up the palace ladder. Deep red signaled formality and power, especially for queens. Lighter reds and pinks floated more toward femininity and youth. Blue carried dignified calm. Green harmonized with nature. White embodied moral purity and respect, which is why so many inner layers were white, clean, crisp, a little symbolic hug of virtue just under all the bright silk. Court ladies were the ones who put all this into action. When preparing ceremonial wardrobes, They didn't just pile layers at random. They curated color progressions, white under soft yellow under deep red under green, for example, to represent balance, season, and event. Some layers were visible only when the royal wearer shifted an arm or turned a shoulder. Little flashes of color were intentional, almost like coded whispers. And this layering wasn't just symbolic. It was also a kind of wearable architecture. Silk drapes beautifully, but it's also slippery. So to build the right silhouette, the gently widening lines, the smooth rounded shoulders, the graceful folds, court ladies used supportive layers underneath. Stiffer fabrics were often hidden beneath softer ones. Some layers weren't meant to be seen at all. They existed only to create shape, sort of like historical scaffolding. The result was that royal robes moved like water, slow, smooth, unchanging, elegant. They gave the wearer a presence that felt more than human, not quite floating but also not quite walking in the ordinary sense. Of course, the royal person inside all those layers probably wasn't thinking, "I am an embodiment of state authority and cosmic harmony." They were more likely thinking, "I hope I don't trip," or, "Wow, this is heavier than it looks," or, "Please let this ceremony end before my shoulders fall off." But the palace women understood the bigger picture. They'd been trained from childhood not just to sew but to interpret meaning. They had to know the difference between ceremonial morning yellow and appropriate afternoon yellow, between reds suitable for rituals and reds meant for quieter occasions. They adjusted hues based on weather. They modified silhouettes depending on season. They monitored the aging of the silk, because even color aging carried meaning, and sometimes needed to be corrected by layering fresh fabric underneath. They were textile strategists, quietly choreographing the entire visual identity of the monarchy. Let's drift now into an area that rarely gets discussed, the royal storage halls. These weren't the casual, throw everything on a shelf and hope it fits kind of places. These were temperature-conscious, organized, heavily supervised rooms where garments were stored in ways that prevented wrinkles, fabric stress, or dye fading. Some rooms housed seasonal clothing. Some stored ceremonial robes that might be worn only once every few years. Some held accessories, hairpins, silk belts, embroidered shoes, ribbon sets arranged by color and length, and small fabric pieces used as emergency repairs. Imagine the quietest craft store you've ever seen, except everything is a priceless artifact and you must never, ever sneeze. Court ladies rotated garments regularly, checking for damage. They aired out fabrics, fluffed layers, smoothed creases, and rest-tacked robes in protective bundles wrapped with unbleached cloth. They documented what belonged to whom, which layers were paired together, and which pieces needed mending. And all this was done with the calm precision of librarians who just so happened to work with silk instead of books. Now, every palace has its own logic. And one of the quieter truths of the Korean court is that clothing wasn't just worn, it was performed. Dressing the monarch was a ceremony. Dressing the queen was a ritual. Dressing visiting nobility was a diplomatic gesture. Even dressing concubines involved rules about rank, season, color, and propriety. So imagine the pressure on court ladies whose job was to prepare these outfits. They had to be perfect, not close enough, not nobody will notice, but perfect. Silk wasn't just fabric, it was political optics. There's a historical saying about palace life: those who serve too close to beauty live too close to judgment. It wasn't meant to be poetic. It was meant as a warning. Now let's drift into one of the most unique aspects of the court textile world: personal measurements. Today we might think of tailoring as a straightforward process. Someone measures your shoulders, waist, arms, and so on. But in the royal court, measuring rulers and consorts wasn't just practical. It was symbolic and tightly regulated. Court ladies in charge of measurement had to follow formal procedures. They measured from precise anchor points on the body, collarbone base, inner wrist line, floor-to-knee distance, often using silk measuring cords rather than wooden rulers. Written measurements were stored carefully, updated periodically, and used to create patterns. And because silk behaves differently depending on humidity and weave, patterns weren't just flat shapes. They included a kind of intuitive adjustment passed down from senior women. These patterns were so stable and so consistent that sometimes a queen could be dressed decades later in garments cut with astonishingly similar proportions, an invisible continuity maintained by women who never signed their work. And speaking of continuity, we can float toward one of the most beautiful legacies of the court textile world: stitched identity. Each court lady had her own stitching style. Not visible to the untrained eye, but absolutely visible to fellow seamstresses. Some stitched slightly longer invisible threads. Some favored tighter curves at seam edges. Some made tiny knots so delicately that you could only feel them by passing the fabric between your fingers. They recognized each other's work instantly. Entire generations of seamstresses created garments with distinct micro-patterns. And even though their names rarely appear in records, their signatures are still there, hidden in seams, buried beneath outer layers, quietly preserved in museum collections today. Let's drift now to the more emotional side of palace clothing, the part that was, ironically, never meant to be seen by outsiders. Because among the many layers, some were deeply personal. If a queen lost a child, her inner layers shifted to somber tones. If a royal woman entered mourning, her layers darkened slowly over months, then lightened gently as the mourning period concluded. If a royal couple experienced tension, sometimes even their clothing combinations reflected their strained relationship, small choices in color pairing that only palace insiders would understand. And court ladies picked up on all of it. They were the quiet observers of royal moods. They heard whispers while adjusting sleeves. They saw tears that never made it into historical records. They noticed nervous hands during dressing rituals, or moments where a queen sighed as if the weight of the silk matched the weight of her responsibilities. They lived inside the gaps of history, the spaces where official documents say nothing, but clothing says everything. And speaking of weight, let's float over to the discussion nobody ever seems to ask: how did royal women move in all of this? Slowly. Very slowly. Each layer restricted arm movement just a little. Combined, they created a gentle resistance that made abrupt gestures nearly impossible. So even if someone felt emotional, angry, frightened, thrilled, they physically couldn't express it dramatically. The clothing forced composure. It encouraged serenity. It practically mandated elegance. And layered silk makes sound. Not loud sound. Just the soft, hushed brushing of fabric against fabric, like two moth wings passing each other in a hallway. That quiet sound became part of palace ambience, a faint texture of motion that signaled someone important was approaching long before they entered the room. Court ladies adjusted their own walking patterns to stay silent behind all this. They mastered a near weightless step. They held their sleeves in certain angles to avoid brushing. They balanced trays, garments, and accessories with the kind of precision that would make modern waitstaff weep with admiration. Which brings us to one final detail for this part: the psychological rhythm of palace work. It wasn't fast. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't loud. Everything was measured. Everything was deliberate. Everything unfolded with the calm inevitability of someone pouring tea very slowly into a porcelain cup. And that rhythm shaped the palace women themselves. They stitched slowly. They spoke softly. They breathed carefully. Their entire lives flowed at the pace of silk, smooth, steady, and quietly disciplined. That's the world that created Korea's iconic multi-layered royal clothing. Not just wealth, not just tradition, but a community of women who lived inside an intricate system of beauty, symbolism, and invisible labor. And with that, let's float gently into the next part, where the layers grow even more ceremonial, even more political, and even more heavy, both literally and metaphorically. Let's drift now into the part of palace life where clothing became less about daily function and more about ritual performance. Those occasions where the silk layers weren't just heavy but spiritually, symbolically, and politically loaded. The kind of events where everyone moved slower, spoke quieter, and breathed a little more carefully because the court was about to enter ritual mode, and rituals demanded precision. In the Korean palace, ceremonial clothing didn't just express identity. It expressed cosmology. Wearing the right layers meant aligning oneself with the universe. Wearing the wrong layers meant, well, social disaster. Not explosive disaster. Just the deeply uncomfortable kind where officials quietly exchange glances like, "Oh dear, someone is wearing evening yellow in a morning ceremony." Nothing ruins your day like a color-coded faux pas. Court ladies were the first line of defense against these mishaps. They memorized seasonal dressing rules. They kept charts, literal color hierarchy diagrams tied to Confucian principles and the 5 elements. They understood which colors matched which types of ceremonies, and they built wardrobes that reflected the cosmic order the monarchy claimed to embody. And among the most significant ceremonial garments were the jiaki for queens and the warat used for weddings and major transitions. These pieces were layered masterpieces, architectures of silk, embroidery, and carefully positioned ornamentation that required multiple women to prepare, adjust, and maintain. The jiaki, for example, wasn't just red for dramatic effect. It was a controlled, specific red symbolizing authority, legitimacy, and the queen's position as the spiritual heart of the royal household. Beneath it were multiple underlayers that shaped its silhouette and allowed the garment to drape with perfect smoothness. Layers of white, pink, or pale yellow often sat underneath, each carefully chosen to shift the tone of the red, like subtle color grading on a film. The embroidery alone could take months. Phoenixes, lotus flowers, auspicious symbols, intricate clouds, all stitched by court ladies who had been perfecting the tiniest of stitches for decades. Embroidery threads were sometimes wrapped in gold leaf, which, predictably, was delicate enough to fray if you even thought about tugging it. And court ladies stitched these designs while sitting for hours at low tables, maintaining posture, maintaining silence, and maintaining concentration. Their hands learned to move with steady, almost meditative precision. Their eyes tracked every thread. Their breathing slowed automatically to match the pace of their work. If modern mindfulness instructors ever want inspiration, they should study palace embroidery rooms. Now, the warat, those iconic wedding robes, deserve a little moment of their own. These garments were living storybooks. They told tales of prosperity, longevity, virtue, and fertility. They featured cranes, dragons, peonies, peaches, and waves. Every symbol was a wish. And the robe itself was only the top layer of a multi-tiered outfit that added weight both physical and metaphysical. Because yes, wedding outfits were heavy. Brides didn't just glide. They carried their status into the ceremony, supported by layers that pressed gently down on their shoulders like a reminder that noble marriages weren't about romance. They were about lineage, alliances, and future heirs. And all of that symbolism, all of that story, was literally stitched by court ladies who would never wear such clothing themselves. Now let's drift into a quieter, more interesting corner, seasonal layer adaptation. Court ladies didn't construct a single 15-layer outfit and call it a day. They modified garments for climate. Korea's winters were freezing. The palace was drafty. Thick wadded layers, cotton batting sandwiched between silk, were used for warmth. These were hidden beneath the ceremonial layers, providing insulation while keeping the outer silhouette intact. And in summer, they did the opposite. They used the thinnest silk possible, gossamer, so sheer you could see your hand through it. Lower layers were minimized. Colors lightened. Airflow was carefully considered. You really haven't lived until you've met a person who has opinions about airflow inside a 12-layer silk outfit. Court ladies were experts in temperature engineering long before clothing brands decided to market breathable fabric technology. Now let's ease into something that sounds small but controlled the entire look: pleats. Modern clothing has pleats too, but palace pleats were on a different level. The width, depth, spacing, and angle of pleats mattered. Pleats had social meaning. Pleats communicated discipline and elegance. The skirt pleats of formal court robes were maintained with such devotion that court ladies literally re-steamed and refolded them regularly, even if the garment hadn't been worn. If a pleat shifted, it affected the symmetry of the entire outfit. And symmetry wasn't just an aesthetic preference. It reflected cosmic order. The universe was balanced. The monarchy was balanced. Clothing had to be balanced. Court ladies used heated rods, flat stones, and tightly controlled steam to maintain these pleats. A single misfold required redoing the entire section. Imagine spending 2 hours perfecting pleats on a garment only to discover a skewed fold right near the hem. Imagine sighing very quietly while preparing to redo the whole thing because palace standards didn't allow shortcuts. And yet, they did it. Daily. Let's drift forward into another fascinating layer, hair and headpieces, which often interacted directly with silk layers beneath the neck. Royal women wore headdresses so elaborate that they required special underlayers to stabilize them. Hair was pulled into shapes that balanced weight and hid the anchor points of accessories. Silk bands, ribbons, and ties held everything in place, and these bands had to be sewn, trimmed, and maintained by court ladies as well. Some headpieces were heavier than some of the clothing layers. Imagine standing for hours with a multi-pound ornament perched on your head while also wearing 12 to 15 layers of silk. No one in the palace was moving quickly, and it wasn't because of etiquette alone. It was because they physically couldn't. Even shoes played a role. Court shoes often had slightly elevated soles and stiff construction. Perfect for posture, terrible for speed. Court ladies cleaned and embroidered these shoes as well, ensuring that the wearer glided rather than clomped. Now, let's wander into one of the more unglamorous but absolutely essential parts of palace life, laundering. Silk doesn't react well to water, soap, scrubbing, sunlight, humidity, heat, or friction. Which is unfortunate because washing clothing usually involves at least 5 of those things. Court laundry specialists had to wash silk without actually washing it in the modern sense. They air-cleaned garments. They spot-treated stains. They used gentle powders. They carefully pressed damp areas. They hung items in shaded breezeways, not too sunny, not too dim, not too windy. It's like caring for a houseplant that shrivels if you look at it wrong. And for garments with many layers, washing each layer separately required absolute organization. If a sleeve lining was removed for repair, it had to be reattached correctly. If an undercollar piece was replaced, the stitch style had to match the original. Court ladies basically had mental inventories of thousands of tiny fabric components. When you think about it, palace wardrobes operated with the precision of a research lab, minus the lab coats, plus a lot of silk. Now let's drift into something more personal, the bond between senior and junior court ladies. Training took years, and older seamstresses passed down not just techniques but rhythm, philosophy, and emotional resilience. They taught younger girls how to manage fatigue, how to keep hands steady even at midnight, how to avoid stabbing silk with a clumsy needle, and how to stay calm when a royal garment needed emergency repairs 20 minutes before a ceremony. They taught patience. Lots of patience. Because palace clothing wasn't a job. It was a lifetime practice. And that practice shaped the entire royal aesthetic. Now let's float toward a perspective shift, the way outsiders saw palace clothing. Most people in Joseon never witnessed royal garments up close. They saw illustrations. They saw ceremonial glimpses from a distance. They saw colors and silhouettes that looked impossibly rich. But they rarely saw the structure underneath, or the women who maintained all those layers. From the outside, the garments looked effortless, magical, a bit unreal. Inside the palace, they were held together by the quiet labor of hundreds of women whose days were structured around silk the way monks structure their days around scripture. Let's move toward the close of this part with a look at ritual dressing ceremonies. These events were slow, very slow. Sometimes nearing an hour from start to finish. Court ladies prepared the garments in advance, laid each layer in the correct order, and then dressed the queen or princess step by step. Some layers were tied. Some were draped. Some were clasped with thread loops. Some were adjusted only after the next layer was added. Court ladies checked symmetry constantly, adjusted collars, smoothed shoulders, ensured the chains of embroidered patterns flowed correctly. They worked with the quiet teamwork of people who had repeated the process thousands of times. And what's remarkable is the calm of it all. No rushing, no chaos, just a slow, rhythmic unfolding of silk, one layer at a time, like watching a painter build a portrait stroke by stroke. At the end, the royal wearer would stand fully dressed, silent, composed, and enveloped in so many layers that the air around them seemed to shift. The final effect was breathtaking, but the credit belonged almost entirely to women who never appeared in paintings, never received official recognition, and rarely appear in written records. But they were there, in every stitch, every fold, every layer. And with that, we can drift gently toward the next part, where we'll look at how these layers evolved through different periods of court history, and how the palace women adapted as fashion, politics, and dynastic fortunes shifted around them. Let's drift back into the palace corridors, where the air stays perfectly still, and the court ladies move with a kind of practiced quiet that borders on supernatural. By the time we reach the late Joseon period, the system of layering silk had become so normal, so deeply ingrained in court culture, that no one even questioned the number anymore. You wore 15 layers because that's just what you did. It was as natural as breathing or complaining about the crown prince's latest poetry attempts. And the ladies who managed these layers, our quiet protagonists of the palace, had perfected an internal rhythm around them. They weren't simply dressing themselves. They were participating in an ongoing performance of order. The palace ran on visible proof that everything inside was controlled, refined, and cushioned by fabric. And nothing cushioned better than silk. It rustled softly, a kind of shushing lullaby, as if begging everyone to calm down and behave. Which was desperately needed because many members of the royal family did not calm down or behave, no matter how many layers they wore. But the court ladies? They found a way to make every movement look peaceful. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't make sudden gestures. They floated. That was their job. And the more layers they wore, the slower and softer their existence became, whether intentionally or just because the garments weighed more than a sack of polite bricks. By this point in our story, we should talk about the women who made the silk itself. Because the palace didn't rely on ordinary marketplace goods. Absolutely not. That would be too simple, and simple was almost illegal within court walls. Instead, the materials came from specialized workshops staffed by women raised from childhood to understand silk production like a second language. They were part scientist, part artist, and part exhausted. Yet somehow, they managed to turn worm spit into fabric fine enough to earn royal approval. Their day started early, before the cauldrons bubbled, before the mulberry leaves were checked for pests, before the palace officials began the daily ritual of asking each other pointless questions simply to avoid real work. These women were already at the silk barns, staring down row after row of plump silkworms who had no idea their short lives would become someone's 15th layer. There was no room for error. Every thread had to be consistent. If a strand snapped, you didn't simply shrug and move on. You sighed, a quiet sigh, of course, and began again. Silk of royal grade wasn't just harvested. It was coaxed into existence through skill, routine, and a level of patience that most modern humans burned through before breakfast. Once the fabric was woven, it passed into the hands of dyers. And the dyes? Oh, they were their own complicated universe. Natural pigments, carefully gathered, soaked, fermented, strained, tested, and stirred. Some colors took weeks to achieve, especially the deeper reds and purples, which were favored by high-ranking court ladies because they announced status without saying a word. Though really, 15 layers already said quite a bit. When a court lady wore a deep crimson underlayer, it meant she belonged to someone important or served a role so central that she needed to be noticed even while trying not to be noticed. Palace logic was rarely consistent, but it always felt justified when wrapped in silk. The court ladies themselves developed a profound relationship with these colors. They recognized them instantly. They could distinguish between two shades of blue that the average person would swear were identical. And they knew how each fabric draped, how it folded, how it behaved under candlelight compared to daylight. They were the silent fashion scientists of the palace, working in a world where appearances were practically a form of governance. And naturally, some women became specialists in layering techniques. Yes, this was a real thing. The palace bureaucracy loved hierarchy so much that even the act of stacking fabric became a skill with ranks and reputation. These were the women who understood how weight needed to be distributed across the shoulders, how the shape of each garment contributed to the final silhouette, how to prevent bunching, sagging, uneven hems, and the dreaded visible crease. Visible creases were not merely unwelcome, they were a near moral failing. One of the greatest layering specialists, according to court records, was a woman whose name rarely appears except in a few dusty administrative logs. But she carried the unofficial nickname, the Iron Sleeve. Not because she was physically strong, though lifting so many layers probably gave her respectable biceps, but because she refused to let a single sleeve wrinkle under her care. Court ladies would request her by name, which meant she lived in a constant state of peaceful panic, floating from room to room, smoothing garments like a ghost who could be scolded. Even kings took notice of the layering rituals. King Sukjong, who enjoyed rearranging political factions like decorative furniture, occasionally paused to admire how the palace women balanced their silks. Of course, he usually followed this by ordering new court dress regulations, because what's the point of ruling if you can't make everyone update their wardrobe every few years? Nothing says, I'm dealing with deep systemic issues, like mandating sleeve width reform. Some of these new clothing rules were practical. Most were not. Some were probably invented because someone complained loudly enough at the wrong moment. And the court ladies were left to adapt, once again, without ever raising their voices. They altered techniques. They relearned folds. They adjusted the order of layers. It was like watching a team of fashion monks navigating an ever-shifting scripture. The layers also served a surprisingly practical purpose in winter. The palace wasn't heated evenly. Some rooms were warm, others were basically outdoor sheds decorated with nicer lighting. So the layers kept the women insulated. And in summer? Well, in summer the layers provided character building and hydration challenges and a lot of polite suffering. But suffering was practically a hobby at court. Still, the layers were worth it. They created a visual language, a quiet vocabulary of rank and duty. The soft glow of pale green might signal a junior lady in waiting. A gentle yellow suggested familiarity with certain palace rituals. A deep midnight blue hinted at someone with access to private chambers. The colors spoke long before the women did. This system became even more refined as new generations of court ladies inherited techniques from their predecessors. Nothing was written down formally. Everything was taught through practice, repetition, and whispered advice passed in the early morning hours as they helped each other tie sashes and adjust collars. These small exchanges were moments of rare warmth in a world built on hierarchy. And that hierarchy was always present. Even in dormitories, the bed closest to the window was a privilege. The woman assigned to manage lamplighting might outrank the one who handled linens. And the lady trusted with the silk storage keys lived in constant fear of damaging anything within those cabinets. Imagine being surrounded by stacks of fabric worth more than your yearly salary, each piece capable of ruining your career if it snagged. Yet the court ladies navigated this world with quiet strength. Their lives were deeply restricted, sure, but they developed their own subtle networks of support. Connecting, whispering, exchanging glances that said far more than words. And layering silk was one of the few tasks that allowed them to touch, adjust, and cooperate closely. It was tactile, human, and cooling or warming depending on the season. That softness mattered. It gave them small moments of calm within a place where emotions were often confined as tightly as their garments. They found a kind of peace in the repetitive nature of their work. Smooth the sleeve, fold the collar, adjust the hem, check the tassel, breathe. Let's drift forward into one of those early mornings. The palace is still dim. A few braziers glow quietly. No one has begun shouting about grain records yet. A pair of court ladies, barely older than teenagers, help dress a senior noblewoman. They speak little. They focus on their tests. First layer, an inner garment of fine linen. Second layer, a soft white silk that settles lightly. Third layer, pale rose pink. Fourth, slightly deeper. Fifth, a whisper of lavender. Sixth, a faint gold like morning tea. And on it goes. The rainbow builds slowly, quietly, until the 15th layer crowns the rest in a shade so rich it feels like authority dyed into fabric. The noblewoman doesn't thank them. She rarely does. But she pauses for a moment as they finish. Maybe she's admiring the colors. Maybe she's just bracing her spine under the weight. Hard to say. With the layers finally settled, she glides out toward her morning audience, leaving the two young court ladies behind. They exchange a tiny glance, half pride, half relief, half, please never make us redo that, and then move on to prepare the next set of garments. Because there was always another set. Always another round of layers. Always another silk story to arrange. And the palace continued to hum softly around them, wrapped in fabric, order, and a whole lot of patience. Let's settle deeper into the palace now, where the walls echo with footsteps softened by silk, and where court ladies navigate their days with the sort of measured calm that only comes from years of training and a lifetime of expectation. By the time we reached this stretch of Joseon history, the rhythm of layering had become so refined, so instinctual, that the women could regulate the pace of their mornings by how quickly their fingers found the right fold in the right garment. And of course, the palace had opinions, strong opinions, about how these layers should look. Not because anyone performed better while wearing them. Not because they promoted health, efficiency, or comfort. Simply because tradition demanded it, and tradition in the Joseon court was like a very picky ancestor staring over everyone's shoulder, making sure no one tried anything too sensible. Each layer carried a purpose. One enhanced shape. Another protected the embroidery beneath it. A third helped regulate temperature against the unpredictable moods of palace architecture, which tended to swing between icy corridors and overheated chambers. And the final layers signaled rank, in that special palace way of saying, if you know, you know, and if you don't, kindly remain confused. The court ladies had to memorize all of it. They had to know the feel of each garment without looking. They had to understand weight distribution like natural physicists. They had to predict how a noblewoman's posture might shift once the layers set, because yes, posture changed. 15 layers redistributed gravity itself. Shoulders opened. Spines lengthened. Breathing became an organized activity rather than an instinct. Some noble women leaned into this transformation. They believed the layers improved their presence, smoothing out their natural awkwardness. Others complained endlessly, whispering about back pain and stiff sleeves, but still wore every layer because the palace did not ask for opinions, just compliance. Meanwhile, the court ladies learned to adapt. If a noblewoman preferred slightly looser sleeves, they remembered. If she tended to shift her weight oddly while walking, they adjusted the hem lengths accordingly. If she had a habit of fidgeting at specific seams during long ceremonies, they applied extra reinforcement to those spots. It was a level of customization that modern luxury tailors would weep over. Despite everything, or maybe because of everything, the layering process became almost meditative. A court lady might begin her work at dawn, but she rarely rushed. Rushing was not elegant. Rushing made layers wrinkle. And wrinkles caused chain reactions of silent judgment that could ripple through the palace like a breeze through a paper screen. The palace also maintained official garments for ceremonies, separate from the everyday layers used for normal duties. These ceremonial ensembles were heavier, often stiffer, reinforced with decorative stitching, padded collars, and embroidered cuffs. Wearing them was like becoming a walking tapestry, beautiful, symbolic, and mildly immobilized. Court ladies took pride in preparing these pieces. It was one of the few times their craftsmanship became fully visible, not hidden beneath another garment. They stitched motifs representing longevity, good fortune, pines, cranes, clouds, waves, nature's greatest hits, displayed in thread. And these motifs were not chosen randomly. Everything had symbolic meaning. Everything conveyed something about the wearer's role, or virtue, or theoretical moral superiority. Even if the wearer was someone who struggled to maintain basic politeness before breakfast, at least the embroidery made her look virtuous. During major rites, a court lady's work would be on display for hours. The nobles might shift, sigh, or quietly wilt under the weight of their garments, but the layers themselves held firm. A sleeve didn't budge. A collar didn't droop. A hem didn't sag, because dozens of women had maintained them, aired them, folded them, refreshed the padding, and adjusted the cords with obsessive consistency. One particularly dedicated court lady from the later 18th century reportedly refused to sleep on the eve of ceremonies until she had personally checked every garment assigned to her ward. She inspected seams with a lamp held so close that several supervisors complained about fire hazards. Still, she insisted that nothing short of perfection would do. Her colleagues called her the Lantern Ghost because she wandered the halls at night glowing faintly with candlelight and anxiety. Another famous anecdote centers on a court lady who developed an uncanny ability to detect fabric flaws through sound alone. She would tap garments with her fingertips, listening for differences in pitch caused by irregular tension or hidden weaknesses. This earned her a reputation as a kind of textile whisperer. Even tailors would consult her, grudgingly acknowledging her strange gift. It wasn't all perfection and mystical threading, of course. There were complications. Some layers snagged on rings. Some bunched incorrectly when worn by someone who insisted on sitting in a way that defied all structural logic. Occasionally, a noblewoman developed strong opinions about fashion trends, and suddenly the court ladies had to adjust every garment in her wardrobe to accommodate a new sleeve width or collar height because she had seen something she liked in a painting. Trends spread quickly in the palace. All it took was one influential lady deciding that a slightly longer cuff felt more poetic, and suddenly everyone wanted longer cuffs. And who suffered? The tailors? Yes, somewhat. But mostly the court ladies, who now had to relearn a whole new layering technique so the longer cuffs didn't bunch awkwardly beneath outer garments. There was also the problem of movement. You couldn't just walk casually in 15 layers. You had to glide. The garments required a slow, deliberate pace. A court lady learned early on how to time her steps with the natural sway of the fabric so that nothing shifted out of place. Younger novices frequently tripped, slipped, or nearly toppled themselves while trying to imitate this controlled elegance. Watching them was like observing young cranes learning to balance. Not graceful yet, but undeniably determined. Senior court ladies corrected them gently. Sometimes with a soft murmur. Sometimes with an expression that said, "You will fix that before you embarrass me in public." Over time, the novices learned how to manage their layers without conscious thought. And when a novice finally mastered the movement, when her steps grew soft, her sleeves aligned naturally, and she could turn without her garments collapsing inward, everyone noticed. Because perfection was quiet, but unmistakable. One might assume that the layers themselves helped with modesty, offering warmth and coverage in a strictly regulated environment. And yes, that was part of it. But the layers also served another purpose, revealing nothing about the wearer's body shape. The palace loved to hide things. Political secrets, personal opinions, the occasional scandal, and also waistlines. Everything was disguised, smoothed, and flattened into anonymity. This anonymity reduced jealousy, discouraged comparisons, and reinforced order. A noblewoman could spend hours preparing to meet the Queen Dowager, only to appear as a carefully arranged silhouette with a polite expression. Her individuality, her feelings, her discomfort, her preferences, were all buried under brocade and silk. And the court ladies were the ones who made sure that burial happened seamlessly. Yet beneath the constraints, moments of subtle rebellion existed. Some court ladies subtly adjusted the weight of inner garments to help a noblewoman breathe easier. Others quietly padded shoes to make long ceremonies tolerable. A few even swapped out heavier embroidery threads for lighter ones to reduce shoulder strain. All tiny acts, all unnoticed by higher officials, but meaningful. These quiet acts of care circulated like little legends among the court women. If a lady felt especially supported or comfortable in her layers, she might whisper, "I think so and so adjusted something for me." And the other women would nod, because they all understood the language of small kindnesses in a place where large kindnesses were rare. As generations passed, the layering system didn't simplify, it expanded. New fabrics appeared. New dyes arrived from trade routes. New regulations were written, often by officials who had never worn a single layer themselves. These officials composed long, tedious documents about sleeve ratios and collar measurements. Court ladies had to interpret these documents with the weary resilience of students deciphering instructions written by someone who had never held a pen. Still, they adapted. Techniques evolved. Finger dexterity improved. Layering times decreased. What once took an hour could eventually be done in 30 minutes by a skilled team. This didn't mean the work grew easier. It meant the court ladies became exceptional at hiding their effort behind serene expressions. Every layer had to align. Every tie had to rest in the correct direction. Every visible corner had to form a perfect angle. And this perfection was groomed through repetition that began when the women were children. Before they entered palace service, many novices practiced on cloth scraps at home. Their families, often poor, often eager for the small salary and rare prestige palace service provided, trained them early. They taught them how to manage thread, how to recognize fabrics by touch, and how to fold garments so tightly they could sit stacked for months without shifting. Once inside the palace, the real training began. Senior court ladies would demonstrate a layer shift, then repeat it, then guide the novice's hands through the motion. Then they made the novice repeat it dozens of times, sometimes hundreds, until the gesture lived in her muscles. The training hall was quiet. Always quiet. Voices drifted softly. The only constant sound was fabric brushing against fabric, a whispery chorus that echoed lightly through the rafters. And eventually, as the girls grew older, the layers became part of them. Their bodies adapted. Their movements slowed. Their breathing became steady, aligned with the rhythm of arranging garments. They stopped fighting the routine and started finding comfort in it. Because the palace, for all its rigid expectations, offered something rare: stability. If the world outside shifted, if kingdoms rose or fell, the palace remained anchored. And silk layering was one of the rituals that made it feel anchored. When a court lady prepared a noblewoman's garments, she wasn't just dressing someone. She was participating in a legacy older than herself, older than her mother, older than her entire family line. She was continuing a tradition refined across centuries, preserved through whispers, repetition, and patience. And as long as the layers remained perfect, the palace felt orderly, predictable, contained, or at least beautifully wrapped. Let's drift back into the quiet corners of the palace, where the real work always happens, behind screens, behind curtains, behind the people who pretend to be important. If you follow the soft steps of the court ladies past the main living quarters, you reach a series of side chambers used almost exclusively for garment preparation. These rooms rarely appear in paintings, because paintings preferred to show royals pretending they didn't rely on anyone. But these rooms were the heartbeat of daily life. Inside one of these chambers, the walls were lined with low cabinets full of folded silks, carefully stacked by color, thickness, season, and rank. A court lady knew instantly which cabinet to open just by hearing what time of day someone called for dressing. Morning layers differed from afternoon layers, which differed from evening layers, which differed from "the queen wants to see you and she's in a mood so wear something calming" layers. Yes, there were emotional dress codes. The palace ran on vibes before vibes were defined. The garments were kept in perfect order to prevent creasing, even though the mere act of breathing near silk risked introducing a wrinkle. So the women handled everything with gentle precision. Hands always clean. Movements always small. The garments were never tugged or stretched. They were lifted as if they were something alive, temperamental, easily offended, and capable of embarrassing you at the worst moment. These garments were rotated seasonally, which was its own ordeal. When spring came, winter garments were aired, brushed, wrapped, and moved into deeper storage. When autumn arrived, the entire process reversed. Court ladies spent days adjusting the wardrobe of each noblewoman, checking patterns, refreshing starch, trimming loose threads, and replacing stiffened cords. They did this without complaining, though many of them mastered the art of the silent exhale, a little sigh that escaped only after the noblewoman left the room. One of the more tedious seasonal tasks involved checking every layer for moth eggs. Yes, even in the palace, moths attempted their own tiny rebellions. Court ladies learned to spot minute signs of intrusion. Any hint of damage led to emergency repair sessions, where experienced seamstresses gathered around a garment like doctors around a patient, muttering gravely about thread tension and structural integrity. Their tools were simple: needles, thread, small brushes, smooth stones for polishing hems, and thin strips of rice paste. But in their hands, these tools could resurrect nearly any silk layer. A sleeve rep added. A collar reinforced. A tear invisibly patched so cleanly that even the wearer would never know the garment had momentarily failed at its only job, existing beautifully. Once the repairs were done, the garments were placed back into storage, layered with dried herbs for fragrance and protection. Court ladies relied heavily on these herbs: lavender, mugwort, chrysanthemum, even dried tangerine peel. Not because they needed to smell luxurious, but because these scents kept insects away. Imagine working in a highly stratified environment where your biggest enemy was a tiny winged creature that could ruin a noblewoman's entire outfit. It was a humbling experience. But then again, court life specialized in humbling experiences, especially for the women who served there. Not all court ladies had the same tasks, of course. Some focused on stitching. Others specialized in color coordination. Some were assigned to a specific noble household. And a select few managed the ceremonial wardrobes, which were stored in their own restricted chambers because losing a ceremonial garment was equivalent to losing one's sanity, livelihood, and place in the palace hierarchy. One woman, recorded only by a half-faded title, served as keeper of the 18 sleeves, a position that oversaw the most formal garments worn during grand rituals. Her job was to maintain the stiff, wide, heavily embroidered sleeves that almost functioned like movable architecture. These sleeves were too large to store easily and too prone to bending if handled incorrectly. So she spent most of her days inspecting the internal padding, smoothing the contours, and adjusting the weights sewn into the seams. Some garments had weights. Not enough to drag someone to the floor, but just enough to ensure the sleeves moved with gravity instead of flapping awkwardly. The palace was many things, but carefree movement was not one of them. When ceremonies approached, the keeper of the 18 sleeves slept even less than usual. She would walk the corridors with her hands clasped behind her back, murmuring to herself about angles and symmetry. Other court ladies learned to stay out of her way, because anyone who disturbed her mid-measurement risked being drafted into a 3-hour lecture about the philosophical importance of sleeve alignment. Meanwhile, behind the main garment rooms, apprentices practiced their skills on scrap cloth. They repeated the same fold dozens of times. They learned how to lift silk without leaving finger creases. They balanced the garments on their forearms to distribute weight evenly. Some practiced tying the waist cords with their eyes closed to improve tactile memory. Their instructors hovered quietly, correcting posture with a soft tap on the elbow or redirecting a fold with a subtle tilt of the head. And the training never really stopped. Even senior court ladies continued refining their techniques well into middle age. Perfection wasn't a stage. It was a lifestyle. The palace provided just enough structure to maintain order, yet not enough comfort to soften the work. At night, court ladies collapsed onto their simple bedding, exhausted. But they slept in predictable shifts, never fully off-duty. If a noblewoman woke with a sudden concern about her garments, someone had to be ready to assist. So the court ladies learned to sleep lightly, attuned to footsteps in the hallway or the soft knock on their door that signaled yet another garment emergency. Despite the constant demands, the women found ways to create small sacred moments of rest. A cup of warm barley tea. A whispered joke between colleagues. A stolen moment of admiration when the morning light hit a freshly finished garment just right. These moments matter in places where everything else is rigid. Sometimes, a court lady's greatest joy was simply organizing her cabinet, refolding the silks into perfect stacks, realigning colors from cool tones to warm, replacing herb sachets. There was something satisfying in the orderliness, something calming in the ritual of touch, fold, press, align. It brought a sense of control to a world where control was rarely theirs. The nobles were not oblivious to the craftsmanship, even if they rarely acknowledged it out loud. A few noble women developed genuine appreciation for the skill involved. They became known for treating their court ladies with slightly more kindness than expected. They allowed extra time for dressing, or refrained from demanding new garments at unreasonable hours. And among the court ladies, these noble women earned quiet praise. "She doesn't yell," someone would whisper. A glowing review, by palace standards. One such noblewoman, the wife of a minor royal prince, was particularly gentle. She had a habit of smoothing her own sleeves as a sign of gratitude, a tiny gesture that meant she noticed the effort put into them. She also walked slowly, not out of elegance but because she didn't want to stress the layers. Court ladies adored her. Not because she was warm or generous, but because she was considerate in a way that required no announcements. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there were women who believed their garments should defy physics. They wanted longer hems, tighter collars, heavier embroidery, and layers arranged in patterns that contradicted every known guideline. Their demands tested the patience of the court ladies, who maintained polite expressions even while quietly recalculating how to prevent a garment collapse. If a noblewoman insisted on a shape that made walking nearly impossible, the court ladies found clever workarounds. They adjusted the tension. They reduced weight in hidden spots. They inserted extra padding to stabilize the silhouette. They did all of this silently, because contradicting a noblewoman was not an option. These unsung adjustments were the true essence of palace layering. The court ladies carried decades of knowledge in their hands, knowledge that didn't show up in historical records but lived in their fingertips, muscle memory, and quiet intuition. And so the system endured. Layer after layer, generation after generation, folded and stitched through early mornings and late nights. It was a world built on calm repetition, delicate judgment, and the art of making the impossible seem effortless. Because in the palace, beauty wasn't just worn. It was constructed. And these women were the architects. Let's glide further into the quiet, folded world of palace textiles, where the walls themselves seemed to hum softly with silk layers, and where the court ladies' work had become so embedded in palace life that it almost defined time itself. Days were measured not by clocks or bell chimes but by which layers had been prepared, ironed, or adjusted, and by which noblewoman's garments awaited inspection. And of course, preparation was never a single event. A single day might involve the same garment multiple times. First for airing, then for folding, then for minor repairs, then for alignment checks, and finally for ceremonial rehearsal. Each step was approached as though it mattered more than life itself, which, to be fair, it often did in palace terms. One misaligned layer could mean awkward glances during an audience, whispered criticisms, or subtle reprimands. Not catastrophic, but psychologically formidable. By the late Joseon period, court ladies had perfected techniques for layer stabilization. They used hidden threads and discrete pins to ensure hems stayed flat and collars stayed upright. They built internal supports to prevent sleeve collapse. Sometimes they inserted thin, flexible strips of bamboo or ivory into folds to maintain structure, invisible to the untrained eye but essential for movement and elegance. And yes, this meant that dressing a noblewoman became a careful choreography, because even the slightest misstep could damage these subtle internal supports. Let's take a closer look at ceremonial layering. Ceremonial garments often included detachable panels, sashes, and extra padding. A royal wedding might require 15 layers of silk, topped with a heavy wart and paired with a multi-piece headpiece. Each layer had to drape in a precise order, often blending colors and embroidery in a way that produced a harmonious gradient when viewed from the front. Court ladies spent hours rehearsing the sequence, practicing lifting, adjusting, and walking without disrupting the delicate balance. And walking was an art form. The layers could weigh anywhere from 15 to 25 kilograms when fully assembled, depending on padding and embellishments. Noblewomen had to glide, not stomp. They needed to maintain posture and composure, often for hours during ceremonies. Court ladies sometimes had to assist, subtly shifting weight, smoothing out folds, or supporting a sleeve from underneath, all without being noticed. It was invisible labor of the highest precision. Storage of these ceremonial garments was itself an elaborate ritual. The fabrics were wrapped in protective cloth, then stacked according to order of use, color, and rank. Some pieces were even scented with herbs and flowers to maintain freshness. Court ladies memorized the arrangement, knowing exactly which cabinet or drawer contained each layer. Losing track of a single garment could cause panic, because replacing a ceremonial robe was not just expensive, it was politically embarrassing. Every court lady also learned to anticipate fabric behavior. Silk behaves differently depending on humidity, temperature, and even how recently it had been handled. A garment that hung perfectly in the early morning might sag slightly by mid-afternoon. Layers could shift subtly while walking. The court ladies studied these changes, developing a sixth sense for predicting movement, ensuring that each robe retained its intended shape for as long as necessary. Their expertise extended beyond textiles. They understood the geometry of movement, how a step affected the hem, how a turn adjusted the folds, and how sitting in a low chair could redistribute weight across multiple layers. They became, in effect, physical engineers of elegance. And their advice was often ignored at first, only to be sought later when a noblewoman realized she couldn't navigate the palace halls without assistance. The relationship between senior and junior court ladies was crucial in this process. Mentorship went beyond technical instruction. Seniors taught patience, subtlety, and diplomacy. They passed down unspoken rules of hierarchy, secrets of seasonal preparation, and strategies for dealing with capricious noblewomen. A young court lady's first experience managing a ceremonial wardrobe was often overwhelming. 15 layers seemed impossible to maneuver. Embroidery details were easily smudged. Sleeves flopped. Collars bent. But with guidance, she learned to manage complexity with calm, quiet determination. Let's pause to consider the social dynamics among court ladies themselves. Despite their shared mission, competition existed. Some sought recognition for extraordinary precision. Others sought to be trusted with rare ceremonial garments. Disputes arose over minor misalignments or the speed of preparation. But most women understood that cooperation was essential. A ceremonial garment required multiple hands to handle correctly. Without teamwork, disasters could quietly unfold. A sleeve could collapse, a hem could misalign, a precious thread could fray. Teamwork extended to scheduling too. Court ladies rotated responsibilities carefully, ensuring that no one was overburdened while maintaining continuity in garment care. Coordination was crucial, especially during festivals, royal audiences, and seasonal rites. Any lapse in timing could disrupt the rhythm of the palace, even if only slightly. And in a place that prized ritual and appearance above all else, minor disruptions were taken seriously. Of course, the court ladies' expertise also encompassed emergency repairs. Silk was fragile. Embroidery could catch. Seams could weaken. Even during carefully managed ceremonies, garments occasionally required last-minute adjustments. Court ladies carried portable sewing kits, emergency threads, and tiny scissors to address problems quickly and invisibly. They mastered techniques that allowed them to repair garments without disrupting the overall aesthetic or revealing their intervention. These interventions were often delicate, precise, and almost invisible. A single misstep could ruin the symmetry, ruin the drape, or leave a noticeable mark. Court ladies practiced emergency repairs for years before being trusted to handle high-ranking noblewomen's ceremonial robes. Even with the most diligent care, layers were physically demanding. Wearing 15 layers restricted movement, required careful posture, and could be exhausting over time. Noblewomen often relied on subtle assistance from court ladies to maintain composure during lengthy events. This assistance was discreet, almost imperceptible, ensuring that the wearer's dignity remained intact. Beyond functionality, layers conveyed meaning. They signaled rank, status, and occasion. They demonstrated adherence to palace regulations, Confucian principles, and aesthetic ideals. Color combinations, layering order, and embroidery placement all had symbolic significance. Court ladies had to understand this language instinctively, translating it into physical preparation and adjustment. And there was an unspoken artistry. While regulations dictated structure, experienced court ladies infused garments with subtle finesse. They adjusted folds, smoothed textures, and aligned embroidery to achieve a harmonious visual effect. This artistry required judgment, experience, and a calm, focused presence. It was invisible work, yet it transformed garments from functional clothing into living symbols of palace order. Over time, layering techniques evolved. New fabrics were introduced. Trade brought unfamiliar colors and textures. Palace regulations adapted. Court ladies integrated these innovations while maintaining continuity. Their work was both preservation and adaptation, combining tradition with subtle innovation. By the late Joseon period, the layering system had reached a point of refinement bordering on ritual. Each action was deliberate. Each fold carried meaning. Each color choice conveyed hierarchy. And behind every success was the quiet labor of women whose names rarely appeared in historical records, yet whose expertise shaped the visual and symbolic landscape of the palace. Ultimately, the story of 15 Layers of Silk is not merely a story about clothing. It is a story about discipline, patience, artistry, and devotion. It is a story of invisible labor sustaining visible order, of generations of women weaving tradition, structure, and beauty into every fold, every hem, and every thread. A story of calm, meticulous mastery that allowed the palace to function, display, and endure. And as we drift further, we'll continue to explore how these layers intersected with palace life, court hierarchy, and the personal experiences of the women who devoted their lives to silk, routine, and quiet perfection. Let's settle into a quieter reflection on palace life, where the true rhythm of the day was dictated less by formal announcements or official decrees, and more by the layering of silk and the steady hands that maintained it. By this stage, the practice of 15 layers had become second nature to the court ladies, a sort of quiet meditation performed in continuous, repetitive motions. Their days revolved around the subtle sounds of silk brushing against silk, the whisper of hems being adjusted, and the soft tap of hands smoothing embroidery. These sounds, which might seem inconsequential to an outsider, served as an auditory signal system within the palace. A soft rustle could indicate that a layer was being aligned. A delicate tap might signal a subtle repair in progress. Court ladies learned to move without disturbing these quiet communications, almost as if they were participating in a symphony conducted entirely by fabric. And the noble women, mostly unaware of these delicate interactions, moved through the palace wrapped in layers, completely reliant on the invisible choreography performed around them. Court ladies also learned to anticipate the habits and preferences of those they served. Some noble women preferred their collars slightly higher, others slightly wider. Some disliked certain colors close to their faces. Some were prone to adjusting their hems unconsciously, which required subtle counter-adjustments from the ladies attending them. These small acts of observation and intervention were crucial to maintaining the polished appearance demanded by palace standards. And speaking of observation, palace layers were never truly static. Even during periods of rest, garments could shift subtly due to movement, posture, or even the weight of the wearer's jewelry. Court ladies became attuned to these minute shifts, correcting them with near-invisible gestures. A sleeve lifted just so, a collar straightened imperceptibly, a hem smoothed without the wearer's notice. These actions defined the skill of a master layer. Mastery was measured in invisibility. If your work went unnoticed, you had succeeded. The work was exhausting in both mind and body. Carrying and adjusting multiple layers required strength, balance, and patience. Even the simplest movement, bending to tie a cord, reaching to adjust a hem, or smoothing a sleeve, could pull on muscles in unexpected ways. Yet the court ladies performed these tasks without complaint, guided by an unspoken understanding that their labor sustained the structure and aesthetic of palace life. There was dignity in the repetition, in the silent accountability to tradition, and in the careful observation of patterns. Let's pause to consider ceremonial preparation. Major rituals could require multiple rounds of dressing and redressing. Noble women might be layered for a morning ceremony, partially undressed for a midday inspection, and then fully layered again for an evening audience. Each relayering demanded precision, efficiency, and a steady mind. Court ladies rotated responsibilities during these periods, ensuring that fatigue did not compromise quality. And even as they worked, they remained aware of the symbolism imbued in each color, stitch, and fold. Sometimes, external factors introduced challenges. Humidity, temperature fluctuations, or even seasonal shifts could alter the behavior of silk. Fabrics could sag, colors could dull, or embroidery could catch. Court ladies learned to anticipate these variables, adjusting the layers accordingly. They became experts in environmental adaptation, modifying garment tension, padding, and alignment to ensure that the overall appearance remained flawless. It was a combination of science, artistry, and intuition. In quieter moments, some court ladies developed techniques for subtle personalization. They might adjust the layering to enhance comfort without altering appearance. They might rebalance weight distribution to reduce strain on shoulders or spine. They might even preemptively correct a slight wrinkle before it became noticeable. These small acts were often uncredited, yet they ensured that the noblewoman's experience of her garments was seamless. Invisible care became a defining feature of court life. Hierarchy among the court ladies was itself layered, though less formally than the silk they handled. Senior ladies directed novices in precise methods, corrected misalignments, and provided instruction on seasonal and ceremonial adjustments. Mentorship extended beyond technical skill. It encompassed patience, discretion, and subtle diplomacy. Young women learned not only how to fold a sleeve but also how to navigate the complex interpersonal dynamics of the palace. A well-prepared layer was as much a symbol of personal competence as of adherence to court protocol. The palace itself seemed to move in tandem with these practices. Ceremonial schedules often revolved around when garments could be prepared, adjusted, and inspected. The timing of audiences, meals, and private consultations was influenced by the rhythm of layering. Palace corridors, halls, and chambers were filled with soft swishes, barely audible creaks, and the quiet footfalls of women who had mastered the art of moving in harmony with fabric. Everything else, the announcements, the rituals, the political maneuverings, was secondary to maintaining this aesthetic and operational order. Even leisure within the palace conformed to the layered structure. Court ladies rarely removed their underlayers completely, and any rest periods were brief and strategically placed. They were constantly aware of their posture, the potential shift of a hem, or the subtle tension in a sleeve. The work required a combination of mental vigilance and physical endurance. Fatigue was tolerated silently. Complaints were unheard, absorbed into the rhythm of service and continuity. In this way, palace labor cultivated an extraordinary form of discipline. Color and symbolism remained central to the process. Each layer communicated rank, purpose, and occasion. Light colors indicated junior status or ceremonial freshness. Deep colors indicated seniority or proximity to royal authority. Specific embroidery motifs conveyed auspicious wishes, virtue, and harmony. The arrangement of layers created a visual hierarchy that reinforced palace norms without explicit instruction. Court ladies internalized this language, translating cultural codes into precise material adjustments. Let's float now to the role of apprentices. These young women often began service with minimal understanding of silk behavior or palace expectations. They learned through repetition, observation, and guidance. Initially, their movements were clumsy, their folds uneven, and their awareness incomplete. Over time, practice transformed instinct. They developed muscle memory, sensitivity to weight and balance, and an intuitive understanding of symbolic significance. Mastery was gradual, often invisible to outsiders, but indispensable to the continuity of palace life. Emergency adjustments remained a constant consideration. A misplaced sleeve, a frayed hem, or a shifting collar required immediate intervention. Court ladies mastered rapid, subtle techniques that restored order without attracting attention. These skills were honed through years of practice, observation, and the occasional crisis. Over time, the ability to perform such interventions became second nature, an essential component of palace discipline. Even the sensory dimensions of layering were significant. Silk textures, embroidered threads, and weight distribution informed tactile memory. Subtle differences in stiffness or color provided cues for correct placement. Court ladies developed highly refined sensory awareness, perceiving minor irregularities that could compromise appearance or symbolism. This heightened attention was critical, as errors could ripple through ceremonial proceedings, subtly undermining the visual coherence of a noblewoman's ensemble. Throughout, the quiet artistry of court ladies reinforced the palace's emphasis on visible perfection and invisible labor. Each noblewoman presented herself according to the palace's expectations, appearing composed, elegant, and harmoniously layered. Yet the true work, the skillful orchestration of fabric, movement, and subtle adjustments, remained largely unseen. Court ladies operated as custodians of tradition, technicians of elegance, and guardians of ritual order, shaping palace life through their meticulous attention to detail. And so, with every fold adjusted, every sleeve aligned, every embroidery motif smoothed, the palace continued its slow, deliberate rhythm. Layers upon layers created not just aesthetic beauty, but also a sense of continuity, order, and discipline that defined the very atmosphere of court life. The 15 layers of silk became more than clothing. They became a tangible embodiment of structure, patience, and the quiet labor that sustained an entire institution. In this way, the story of the court ladies is a story of mastery born from repetition, endurance, and devotion. It is a narrative of invisible labor maintaining visible order, of rhythm and ritual entwined with human skill. And though the noble women wore the garments, it was the court ladies who ensured that beauty, structure, and tradition persisted, one carefully folded layer at a time. Let's move gently into the subtler aspects of palace life, where layers of silk intertwined with layers of social nuance. The court ladies' work was never only technical, it was deeply social, requiring awareness of rank, temperament, and the unwritten rules of palace etiquette. Every adjustment they made carried meaning, intentional or otherwise, and each gesture could influence how a noblewoman was perceived, even if the action itself remained invisible. Consider, for example, the practice of layering in preparation for private audiences. Noblewomen were often dressed in ensembles that signaled decorum, loyalty, or virtue, and the precise arrangement of silk indicated subtle alignment with palace expectations. A poorly arranged layer might be interpreted as negligence, lack of respect, or worse, subtle rebellion. Court ladies were acutely aware of these stakes. Their hands not only manipulated fabric but also mediated social perception. They were silent diplomats, negotiating the optics of rank through folds, hems, and sleeves. There was also the challenge of accommodating individual quirks. Some noblewomen had pronounced habits, twisting a collar nervously, shifting a sleeve during long ceremonies, or leaning slightly to one side while walking. Each of these behaviors could disturb layers, misalign embroidery, or stress hidden supports. Experienced court ladies anticipated these tendencies, adjusting layers preemptively and subtly correcting misalignments. Their work was predictive as much as reactive, a continuous dialogue between human behavior and fabric. Ceremonial garments demanded heightened attention. Weddings, ancestral rites, and seasonal festivals often required extra layers, special embroidery, and carefully coordinated colors. These events could last for hours, with noblewomen remaining in their ensembles for extended periods. The weight, stiffness, and complexity of the garments challenged both wearer and court lady. Maintaining posture, smoothing folds, and ensuring the symbolic integrity of each layer demanded extraordinary concentration. Any lapse could be socially or politically significant, even if unnoticed by the casual observer. Court ladies also had to master timing. Layers could be draped too early, causing wrinkles or sagging, or too late, creating logistical challenges. Coordination between attendants ensured that garments were assembled in the correct sequence, with sufficient time for inspection, rehearsal, and final adjustment. This choreography required foresight, patience, and deep familiarity with both the garments and the palace's daily rhythm. Apprenticeship remained central to sustaining expertise. Young court ladies began by observing seniors, gradually taking on simpler tasks before progressing to complex ceremonial layering. Mistakes were instructive rather than punished, within reason, but the expectations were exacting. Novices quickly learned that precision, composure, and subtlety were not optional. A single misaligned fold could ripple outward, affecting ceremonies, appearances, and the perception of competence. The social networks among court ladies were equally layered. Collaboration was essential, yet hierarchy shaped interactions. Senior attendants guided novices, coordinated group tasks, and mediated disputes. Junior ladies learned not only technical skills but also the subtleties of timing, discretion, and interpersonal sensitivity. These networks created a system of shared responsibility, allowing the palace to function smoothly even under the weight of multiple ceremonial demands. Environmental factors influenced garment management as well. Silk is sensitive to humidity, temperature, and light. Court ladies monitored conditions constantly, adjusting storage, airing, and alignment as necessary. Even minor fluctuations could affect drape or embroidery tension, so vigilance was continuous. These adjustments, though quiet, were critical to preserving the aesthetic and symbolic integrity of the garments. Consider the experience of a single day in the life of a palace wardrobe. Morning light filtered through paper screens, revealing a cascade of colors stacked neatly in cabinets. Court ladies moved silently, retrieving, unfolding, and inspecting garments for the noblewomen scheduled for audiences. They smoothed hems, adjusted collars, and aligned embroidery, working in synchrony to maintain consistency. The noblewomen arrived, glided through the halls, and performed their duties as if every fold and layer had been effortlessly perfect. Meanwhile, the labor underpinning this appearance remained invisible, continuous, and essential. Even personal care within layers demanded attention. Silk could restrict circulation, alter posture, and create subtle discomfort. Court ladies learned to distribute weight evenly, pad areas prone to strain, and adjust garments to accommodate minor shifts in the wearer's stance. These interventions required both anatomical knowledge and keen observation. The noblewoman might remain unaware, but the success of a long audience often depended on these subtle adjustments. The artistry of layering extended to color and symbolism. Gradients, contrasts, and harmonies were deliberate. Certain colors indicated season, rank, or familial alignment. Others conveyed personal virtue or propriety. Embroidery motifs further communicated auspicious messages, reinforcing cultural values and societal expectations. Court ladies internalized this semiotic language, translating abstract concepts into physical arrangements that were immediately readable to those familiar with palace codes. Ceremonial layering intensified this semiotic function. Weddings, royal audiences, and ancestral rites involved complex ensembles that carried multiple layers of meaning. Court ladies coordinated these details meticulously, ensuring that every fold, tie, and embellishment aligned with intended symbolism. Their labor translated the abstract hierarchy of the palace into tangible visual cues, reinforcing order and ritual continuity. Mastery of layering was cumulative. Court ladies refined skills over decades, developing subtle judgment and tactile memory. The interplay of weight, fabric, movement, and posture became intuitive. Experienced attendants anticipated potential issues before they arose, preventing wrinkles, misalignments, or strain. Their expertise was both technical and social, shaping appearances, facilitating comfort, and sustaining ritual precision. The emotional dimension of this labor was also significant. Court ladies operated in a world defined by hierarchy and expectation, yet within these constraints they found moments of quiet satisfaction. The successful completion of a complex layering sequence brought a sense of achievement, a rare glimpse of control in a highly regulated environment. Small gestures, aligning embroidery perfectly, smoothing a stubborn sleeve, or adjusting a hem without detection, offered satisfaction and subtle empowerment. Even in moments of apparent stillness, their vigilance never ceased. Nighttime brought limited rest, punctuated by readiness for unexpected needs. Noblewomen might awaken with sudden concerns, ceremonial schedules could shift, and garments required inspection or adjustment at unpredictable hours. Court ladies adapted, maintaining composure, skill, and discretion. In this way, the layering system became more than a set of rules or a stylistic choice. It functioned as a mechanism of palace order, social signaling, and personal discipline. Each layer carried historical, aesthetic, and symbolic weight. Each adjustment reflected knowledge, skill, and intuition. The 15 layers of silk were both a literal and metaphorical structure, sustaining appearance, ritual, and hierarchy within the palace. Ultimately, the practice exemplifies the extraordinary labor, patience, and artistry of the court ladies. Their skill ensured continuity, stability, and elegance. Their work was quiet, largely invisible, yet indispensable. Through careful attention to every fold, color, and stitch, they preserved centuries of tradition, maintained complex social hierarchies, and enabled noblewomen to present themselves with flawless grace. In essence, the 15 layers of silk were not merely garments. They were the embodiment of precision, care, and continuity. They were living symbols of discipline, artistry, and invisible labor. And they remind us that history often unfolds not only in dramatic events but in the patient, meticulous work of those whose names rarely appear in records, yet whose influence shapes perception, ritual, and culture.